welcome. How many of you are my either current or former students? Oh, that's nice, thank you.
Are you paying child support on the rest of it?
Very much appreciate you coming out. And we have faculty with us, Dr. Marion, my chair, Dr. Gennaro. We have a few people I don't recognize, but most of you I do recognize. It is a privilege to be here tonight. I won't wear this much longer, it's a little warm. You're welcome to be as casual as you would like. If for some reason you need to leave, you may do so. But I think you will feel compelled enough that you will want to stay as long as you can. And when you're done, we'll have some chocolates from my distributorship. So if you do want to try one of my chocolates, we'll be able to have that when we finish. They're milk chocolates, so if you have an ethical objection, I can't overcome that at this time. So let me give about a 2-minute introduction to a guy I could brag on for a long, long time. He's like a big brother to me. He's one of the few preachers I would rather listen to than to hear myself. We share an awful lot theologically, experientially, ethically, socially. I'll tell you in a minute about his impeccable credentials, and several of you have had the privilege of hearing him yesterday while he was presenting one of the chapters from his very recent book that came out about the last day of July. I know we got it I think mine was autographed on about the 30th of July. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. Ray with us. Now, let me say one thing seriously, and I told Roger, I said, the one thing I will not do is I will not allow you to let me introduce you without fanfare. There's a movie in the 80s, which means most of you were not alive. There's this great movie, Max Dugan Returns. Rocco, would you have seen that by chance? Jason Robards plays, in a movie, he plays the grandfather of a smart kid who goes to college and decides maybe he wants to be a philosophy major. And Jason Robards says, that might be a good choice. And the kid says, well, Grandpa, can you make any money in philosophy? He says, if you have the right philosophy. Okay. Here's the question. When it comes to ethics, and Dr. Ray, and myself, Dr. Gennaro, Dr. Merritt, we all teach ethics. Most of you had me or one of these other gentlemen for ethics. Question would be, if you teach ethics, can you get in trouble? If your ethics are compelling enough. Glad Roger's here, and he's not yet been overcome by martyrdom.
Not that I haven't tried.
Not, well, he's been available. We've talked about he has had death threats legitimately investigated by governmental agencies, but he has been on one occasion held at gunpoint for 5 hours. That itself would be probably a separate presentation. But the guys that I know in ministry are generally uninformed, irrelevant, lazy, boring, uncommitted. Roger is the antithesis of every one of those conditions. And he has quite literally, and I can say that quite literally, and I know that's the most abused adverb in the English language, but he has quite literally put his life on the line over his commitment to social justice. He's going to talk to you about a combination of two things: the weaving together of a new, may I say, paradigm in religion, where it's not about magic and superstition and absurdities that modern people should not be expected to believe, really shouldn't even have to consider any longer. But is there a way to come away, having moved through that, into a very positive and engaging social and communal ethic? His credentials are impeccable. Roger and I have been pastors for about 34 years apiece now, I guess, somewhere in that range. He is a native of Kentucky. Colin, you can't hold that against him, but he is a native of Glasgow, Kentucky. He did his bachelor's degree in philosophy at Murray State University. He did his master's and doctorate at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And then several years ago, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard under the Merrill Fellowship, where I'm very jealous, among others, he got to study with Harvey Cox. He can tell you about a lot of different things. I know his presentations are superb. He will engage you. I think he might allow questions along the way. That'll be up to him. But when he's reached the conclusion of what he intends to present, I would like for several of you to have your questions and dialogue with him. Above all, he is one of my very best friends, and in the ministry, my best friend. And ministers are not easy to have as friends. But Roger is. A round of applause for Dr. Roger.
Turn this projector off. You know how to do that. Yeah, the whole thing about trying to get along with preachers is tough. I think it was Charles Wesley who said that ministers are like manure. If you spread them around, they can do a whole lot of good, but if you just get them all together in one place, it just stinks. And I think going to clergy gatherings is one of my least favorite things to do ever. I really do appreciate you all coming out on a weekday night. I hope that some of you at least are going to get some extra credit from somebody from being here, but I'll be nothing but a set of taillights tomorrow morning, so I won't be able to do anything for your grade point average, but I'm glad you're here. I am grateful that Brian is my friend and that he's been using my book in some of his ethics classes, and I have been grateful to get to, I was just earlier, well, it's March now, or April now, and the first 2 weeks of March I was in a lecture tour in Great Britain, attending several conferences there, talking about progressive faith. So when I started to get these invitations to travel and speak, I thought I need to get this together in a book, partially because I have a fairly popular YouTube channel now, and I get emails from people all over the world saying, well, what about this and what about this? And I felt like I was answering the same questions over and over again. So I finally wrote out the list of the most asked questions about what progressive faith is and tried to answer each of those questions in fairly succinct chapters. I know the word succinct doesn't typically apply to people who teach and study philosophy, but in my case I really did try to keep it fairly brief. It's a fairly short book, and I hope I can recommend it to you wholeheartedly. The church itself is in crisis at this time. It is rapidly shrinking in most parts of the world, certainly in Europe, on both the east and the west coast of the United States. And even though we hear lots of stories about mega churches and gigantic churches that are popping up here and there, by and large, the average attendance in a church in the United States now is less than 40. And there are an awful lot of churches in Europe. Many of the places where I spoke in Great Britain recently had congregations of 12 and 14 people trying to keep up a monstrous structure that is falling apart all around them. Now, the church has come and gone through the centuries. There's been waning and increasing interest in religion, so that there have been times when the Constitution of the United States was signed, some historians estimate that there were as few as 3% of the people in the United States that actually were attending church at the time. Then there was the Great Awakening, there was a second Great Awakening, big revival movements where they came back. But I think it's a reasonable question to ask ourselves in this day, is this decline one of those trends that will just be a setback, or is this it? And I think in many ways we can say in the modern era, with education and communication and the sciences being what they are, I think traditional religion is absolutely going to die, and I don't think it will make a comeback. So if there is something of value to a spiritual life, we need to figure out what that is and figure out how it can be relevant in a post-ecclesial era, or maybe even a post-theistic era. There has been, for 100 years, a huge gulf between the classroom and the pew. People that would go away, not just to the top tier seminaries. I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to attend Harvard and Vanderbilt, but I know people that go to seminary in Kansas City and St. Louis, and some even in Fort Worth, Texas, which is unimaginable to me, but people that go to decent, accredited graduate schools of religion for 100 years have been disabused of the Iron Age mythologies and superstitions that have defined traditional Christianity. We all read Tillich. We all read Bultmann. We all knew that God doesn't get infused into a human body. We all knew about the metaphors that come to us out of Iron Age thinking and ways of expressing themselves. We all knew it in the classroom. We all had to write those papers. But then you get a job working for a church, you put on the vestments, you've got a board that's expecting you to repeat for them the same rituals and the same creeds and the same beliefs that they have heard generation after generation. And I think even Bultmann gave us permission 100 years ago, almost now, 70, 80 years ago, to say, those of us that are critical thinkers use the language of the church, we just mean it differently. We can use the language of the church, we can talk about resurrection, but we don't really believe that a dead guy gets up and walks out of a tomb, as is going to be declared in churches all across the United States on Sunday. We understand resurrection as metaphor, that you can go through a divorce and recover your life. You can be sick and recover your health and have a new life. We understand resurrection as a powerful metaphor and image, but we don't see it literally, but we keep talking to people who do. And that gets proven time after time. So my question, and I took a painful sabbatical from church because I absolutely couldn't stand it anymore. I absolutely couldn't stand the mythology and the superstition that was around it. But I started thinking about what I was missing, what I would like to have if I went back to church. And I tried some of the more traditionally liberal congregations, and I was so bored. You know that if any group of people tells you that you've got to put your phones away and not look at them during a talk, that evidently the talk will not stand on its own 2 feet. If I have to beg you to not be distracted, because I'm sitting in a Unitarian church reading my email, just like I was 16 years old. It was just mind-numbingly boring. So the question that's presented to me now is, can you marry your intellect to your heart? Can you find a perspective that allows you to interpret the universe, your experiences, your life, your morals, through a spiritual lens that is honest to your intellect? When you first started in maybe elementary school, maybe not till middle school, you had a science teacher that showed you a model of an atom. And it had protons and neutrons with whizzing electrons around it. And so you had these little orange-colored balls and blue-colored balls with the bright lights of electrons whirring around it. And you begin to think, well, this is what an atom is. And the universe is made of protons and neutrons and electrons. And then you get to see the table of elements, and there's 118 different elements, and each one are different combinations of protons and neutrons, and the 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 in the next one, 18 in the next one, and then it's 2 times n to the squared to figure out how many electrons can be in each shell of an atom, and you start to think this is what an atom is. But in truth, no one can see an atom, and if you could see an atom, it wouldn't look like this. It's a model. It's a model that helps you to understand physics. As in this almost mantra-like quote that we had from the physicist earlier, there are 12 particles of matter and 4 forces of nature. That's what makes up the known universe. If there is anything other than 12 particles of matter and 4 forces of nature, we are speculating about it, but this is what we know of. But you cannot say that that model that you were shown when you were a child is the end of what can be known about physics. It's a start. It's an introduction. And much of religious language is exactly that. We invented religious explanations to help us to understand the universe as we encountered it. Atonement, the notion that Jesus of Nazareth died for the sins of the world so that you could have a right relationship with God. This notion of atonement is invented in a culture that still has a memory of animal sacrifice. But the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and even Jews didn't sacrifice animals anymore. The religion almost overnight was transformed from a cultic sacrifice priestly religion into a religion that was rooted in synagogue worship and in a text taught by rabbis. So there was this radical shift away from a sacrifice cult into a textual religion, but we kept the language of atonement and keep saying it to a culture that has no experience of that. You think of some of the hymns that you may have sung when you were a kid. Have you been washed in the blood? I can't even imagine that. That's obscene. What a horrible idea. But we keep reiterating these notions as if they somehow still had traction in our society. The notion of the Trinity, created approximately during the time of the Council of Nicaea, solved a philosophical problem of the age. How can God, who is transcendent, also be embodied in a human being? And if God can have a son, then why can't he have a daughter, or have more sons, or have a whole bunch of families? So you invent a notion of a Trinity that solves a philosophical problem in the 3rd century, but it doesn't solve a philosophical problem in the 21st century. The only way that you can get someone to actually make their mind go into that forum in this age is to threaten them with eternal punishment. You must believe these things or you become anathema to God. Again, that's a pretty bad way to teach a particular topic. You are so evil that God had to kill his own son. Look, I've done some rough things in my life, maybe that deserved a fine, but not the death of the Son of God. I mean, how absurd is it for us to keep trying to whip ourselves into believing that notion? It was an inadequate explanation at the time, and it wasn't even the only explanation used within the church of the time, but it was an Iron Age notion that has been translated into the modern era, and it doesn't meet with the meaning universe of our current time. Karen Armstrong, one of the famous members of the Jesus Seminar, wrote in one of her biographies that she had been a nun. She was a British scholar, and she'd been a nun, and one of her professors had assigned a paper on the resurrection, and the professor's handing who is a nun, is passing the papers back out, and she leans over and she says, "Sister Karen, you've done a great job on this paper. You're going to go far in this order. You're an excellent thinker." And Karen Armstrong looked at her and said, "Yes, but sister, none of it is true, is it?" And the sister said, "Shh, of course it's not true. Just don't tell the others." It's the sort of inside secret within the ecclesia that we have things that we know are true, but we're not allowed to say it in the public. Now, I teach world religions, as Brian does and some others, and one of the things that has occurred to me, especially teaching Western religions, is that a lot of the notions that end up in Christianity and Judaism and Islam are born in the Persian slave ghettos of Zoroastrianism. And you can see that Zoroastrianism is a reaction to the oppression of slaves in Persia. And if you buy the Moses story as being at all historical, and mind you, it is written through a religious lens, so you don't want to get too hard-nosed about the history of Moses, but even if you just take the framework, it is a group of escaped slaves leaving the oppression of Egypt. If you look at the beginnings of Christianity, it is an occupied country in which someone is rebelling against the power of the empire. Christianity begins as an alternative to the religions of the empire. Even Islam, which is influenced by Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Judaism, all three religions are present in Mecca and Medina at the time that Muhammad begins to have his own spiritual awakening, and he brings all three traditions to try to unify the impoverished warring clans of his area. All of the Western world religions began as a practice of ethics responding to the abuse of the powerful over the weak. They then became translated into a set of creeds and beliefs and rituals. But that isn't how they started. Many Jesus scholars would even argue that Jesus of Nazareth wasn't particularly religious. His primary interest was not in religious aspects of Judaism or Judaism's reform, but about the ethics and the abusive economic system in which he found himself. If you look at what the creative tension is, even in the Synoptic Gospels, which are the ones that were not burned by the Roman Empire after Constantine, there were lots of other versions of the stories and teachings of Jesus, all of which were forcibly made to disappear as the church was codified after Nicaea. But even there, you see the primary tension is between a teaching of radical compassion and a teaching of personal piety. It wasn't Christianity versus Judaism, it was compassion versus piety. How do I stay pure? How do I keep myself from being made unclean? As opposed to the teachings of Jesus, who touched lepers, who was willing to heal on religious holidays, who was willing to say, sell all you own and give it to the poor, who didn't, when asked about issues related to paying taxes, didn't even have a coin, had to say, somebody show me a coin. It completely eschewed personal property or ownership of any kind of assets at all. So you see this radical compassion as his teaching of a way of life that then becomes a set of beliefs. You look at one of the earlier creeds, the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father, creator of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. You know how to say it very fast, but look. Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. What did he say? What did he represent? What did he do? Why is he important? Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. Not even a comma. There's absolutely no content to it whatsoever. It's all about, it's the message about him and not his message. So we have inside language, again, pardon me for theology stuff, but we call it orthopraxy. That is, orthodoxy is right beliefs. Orthopraxy is living the right way. Even in that most ancient strata of religion, Zoroastrianism, again, that religion that was the precursor to the other major Western religions, the question of how do I live a good life? What does it mean to be in harmony with God? Right thoughts, right speech, right action. Those three things. And the Zoroastrians invented concepts of heaven and hell. They didn't exist in older forms of Judaism, but they invented the notion of the lake of fire and the place of eternal bliss. But they said that the departed would cross the Shinvolt Bridge into eternity, and if you had lived by right thoughts, right words, and right actions, the bridge stayed flat and you walked into eternity. But if you had not, the bridge turned on its side and it was as narrow as a knife blade and you fell into a lake of fire. But that is the beginning of the ethics of the three major world religions, and I'm not sure we've made any improvements on it. That ultimately what we're looking for, and the answer to what does it take to be a good person, isn't about baptism or Eucharist or speaking in tongues or being born again. It's about right thoughts, right words, right actions. That orthopraxy trumps orthodoxy, in my sense, in every case. I would even say that there's some sense in which the orthodoxy of the 4th and 5th century has been misrepresented in the fact-literal age of the 21st century. Those of you that, none of you are old enough to have grown up in a Latin tradition, but you've at least heard the beginning of the Creed, Credo in Deum Patrem Omnipotem. I believe in God the Father Almighty. Marcus Borg, recently deceased, just died last month, but a great scholar. If you ever want to make a start in readings of the Jesus Seminar, I think Marcus Borg is the best place to start because he's the kindest. Some of the rest of us write with, I'm going to break your teeth off in the front of your face if you don't get this point right away. But Marcus is rather more kind. in how he writes. If you wanted to read Representative book, I think The Heart of Christianity, but
Meeting Jesus again.
Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time is what we've used as textbooks for, gosh, 20 years now. But I heard him do a talk about it. He said, credo in Latin, we translate creed. You know, we say it's the Apostles' Creed because of the Latin nomenclature. But he said credo doesn't mean so much fact literal belief. He said it would be better rendered as beloved. That to say I love the tradition of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. I love the tradition of that was the place, like that science classroom where the teacher told you about protons and neutrons and electrons. That this is where I had my spiritual birth, in the language of these symbols, of these metaphors. And so it is okay for me to say that I love it, even to be nostalgic about it at times. Our good friend Bishop John Shelby Spong, one of the most published religious authors alive today, is an Episcopal bishop, a retired Episcopal bishop, and he still goes to a traditional liturgy on Sundays. He still sings the songs and repeats the refrains of the traditional Episcopal liturgy. Not that he literally believes any of those to be accurate descriptions of the reality in which he lives, but because he loves the tradition. I personally don't participate in that sort of thing because it isn't that meaningful to me. But I can tell you that 10 years ago on Ash Wednesday, I was putting a cross of ashes on people's foreheads because there are certain aspects of the rituals of traditional faith that do convey meaning, and they do give you a sense of identity. Identify with this group. This is part of who I am. This is my family. This is my heritage. But I think we have to be willing to liberate our minds from being trapped in the sense that we have to continue to think that way for the rest of our lives. If love is our religion, if we can get past the metaphors and images and threats of traditional religion, then no one ever has to go to hell anymore. No one ever has to be afraid of God or demons anymore. No one can tell you what you have to believe. The formal institutional religion through which most of us were reared helped us to structure our thinking, and frankly, it helped us to battle our destructive appetites, our impulses. We learned how to choose the good over that which is self-destructive. But you spend the first several years of your life going to school learning how to stand in line, but at some point, men and women, you have to learn how to get out of line, to let go of the institution, to move beyond the models and the drawings and be free to be a genuine, thinking, spiritual person. The 17th century Japanese poet Matsuo Basho said it this way: "Do not seek to follow in the steps of the men of old. Seek what they sought." Don't just try to imitate Muhammad or Jesus or Moses or Zoroaster, but consider what it was they were after. What kind of life, what kind of world were they after? And pursue that. That doesn't mean that we have to despise ancient religions or ancient texts of religions. We can be inspired by them, but we have no reason to enshrine them. We should strive to be who they were. During my early education, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell was despised for being a rather snide and condescending atheist, but I wish the church had been more willing to listen to what he was really saying. Our fact-literal application of ancient myths and personifications of nature was robbing the modern world of the fabulous potential that it has for joy, love, liberty, freedom. Once you train your children to believe things for which there's absolutely no evidence, if you can make them show loyalty to a religious code or system that makes mothers and fathers despise their own children if they turn out to be gay, or if they get a divorce, or if they commit a crime, then you can convince people to wear a bomb into a crowded marketplace, or murder an artist or filmmaker who demeans your faith. Think of the worst historical examples of atrocities from the Holocaust to ISIS. before any such insanity can take place, you first have to extinguish critical thinking skills to inculcate unreasoned loyalty in an unwary public. Voltaire said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." If you get used to believing things for which there is no reason to believe them, then it is not a very long stretch to persuade you to commit atrocities. If you can make a child believe in the literal truth of a list of unprovable myths, then it's not a great leap to get them to be absolutely loyal to any dictator or violent political ideology that comes down the pike. What Bertrand Russell was saying to us was just this. And let me read this exactly. "I wish to propose for the reader's favorable consideration a doctrine which may, I fear, appear wildly paradoxical and subversive. The doctrine in question is this, that it is undesirable to believe a proposition when there is no ground whatever for supposing it is true. I must of course admit that if such an opinion became common, it would completely transform our society, our life, and our political system." Russell wasn't trying to take away ethical deliberation. He wasn't trying to take away from religion a sense of community, the compassion, the love that gives us a reason to be a spiritual community. He was asking us to set aside magical thinking. He was asking us to set aside loyalty to superstitions, superstitions that have historically led us to violent extremism, divided families, and made being a human being something to be ashamed of, and has filled us with self-loathing, if not fear of our own bodies. We have for centuries taught our children to loathe their own sexual impulses and to despise themselves for having the very evolutionary appetites that perpetuates our species. Can anyone with an IQ in double digits tell us with a straight face that either God or Jesus or Muhammad ever had a moment's desire to push off such absurd and neurotic guilt feelings on anybody? Now, if you can bear with me for just a few more minutes, I want to try to get into what we were saying, Rocco, about a priori and a posteriori thinking. When I started as a philosophy student years ago in Kentucky, there are philosophers in Kentucky. I can't tell you how anxious my friends were when I told them I was coming to Indiana. You all haven't been getting a lot of great press lately either. So it's not like Indiana is suddenly the Mensa Club capital of the world. But I'm proud to be here with you guys, but I'm glad there's no windows where anybody can hear what we're saying in here. My first philosophy professor, Dr. Jim Spicer, said, "Imagine the room is filled with 4-foot-tall scrincheon. The scrincheon are invisible, they have no mass, and they are visible only to me." In saying that, he was introducing us to the notion of an a priori truth claim that could not be verified by external evidence, nor could the claim be subjected to any kind of repetition or testing. Though there was no way to prove that the room was not full of scrincheon, there was also no particular reason to believe that he was telling the truth. Still, I knew I would be foolish if I started to believe that I was surrounded by these invisible beings. But it would take me another decade to have the courage to apply the same conclusion to what I had been told by my Sunday school teachers about angels and demons and a talking snake and a guy who walks on water, which of course, Jesus wasn't the first to walk on water, you know. There's Buddha and Zoroaster and a couple of other guys also claimed it, and Krishna did too. Wasn't there a Krishna story of walking on water? So, neat trick, repeated often. After years of trying to teach philosophy and religion to my own college students, I recognized the difficulty in trying to explain how a story can convey important life principles while not being either historically or factually accurate. We believe much of what we believe because our family, our community, our church, or our nation has passed along those beliefs, and we would be out of sync with the world if we didn't at least act like we went along. In matters such as putting the fork on the right-hand side of the plate, or shaking hands with our right hand, or the fork goes on the left side of the plate. Don't set the table based on what I say to you. or standing for the national anthem, it is easier to go along than to demand a persuasive explanation. But when it comes to be told that, for example, being homosexual is a sin worthy of eternal punishment, or women cannot be leaders in faith communities, or that you must belong to one certain sect of one certain religion or become anathema to Almighty God, then some critical thinking is called for. The famous philosophical maxim known as Occam's razor is often mistakenly applied to say that the most simple explanation is the accurate one, or the most likely one. Occam was a British monk, by the way. What Occam's razor actually says is that the solution requiring the fewest number of unverifiable assumptions, that your conclusion should be the one that you can reach without having to make assumptions for which there is no evidence or proof. So if I ask you, is this room full of scritcheon? And you consider that there's absolutely no evidence for it, that there's no way to test it, and that the only person asking you to do it is a fairly facetious philosophy professor, then you can assume that there are no scritcheon present. You could be wrong. I mean, they could be here. There's just no good reason to assume that they're real or that they're here. That becomes more complex, though, when it's an authority figure, such as your parents, your friends, your classmates, who are all fairly united in telling you that you really must believe in scritcheon. Then you have to be more resolved in your application of critical thinking to avoid falling in line with this especially shared faith in scritcheon. Of course, belief or disbelief in the existence of scritcheon doesn't affect how you live your life. Assertions about heaven and hell, a final judgment, the nature of salvation, the definitions of sin, these do matter. In fact, they matter more than anything else in life. Yet, for most part, there's not much evidence to substantiate the supernatural claims, and attempts at giving evidence to them never stand up to critical analysis. That book, Proof of Heaven, you read that cover to cover. There's not a line of proof in it. There's no proof. It's all truth claims. It's all personal testimony. I suspect that most of the people who have slowly abandoned a life of faith were not quite sure why they have stopped believing. They might even tell you that they're spiritual but not religious. What they are feeling is that the old myths, the old stories developed by sheep herders on a flat earth in ancient Palestine no longer have power for them. So they will drift away, not really sure why, but they are very much relieved to be free of the time constraints, the tedious hymns, the uncomfortable clothing, and the dead rituals that have defined church for a millennia. My fear is that they're also losing a part of what makes them human. Isn't our connection to one another what really makes us people? Isn't it friendship, affection, family, signs of compassion to those who are in need, caring for those who are ill, giving direction and encouragement to the young, and companionship to the elderly? For me, religion was never about heaven and hell. I had the good fortune of growing up in a religious context in which such things were never stressed. It was never about Trinity or Christmas or Easter. For me, it was always about meaningful connection. But when those stories and myths held in a particular religious text were our meeting place, it was those stories that brought us together. It was reading those texts that was our common ground. There was no reason to put them under the microscope. Now, with the myths and superstitions stripped away, we're left with naked reality. 12 particles of matter, 4 forces of nature. What is and what is not. There is only us. And now we either love each other or we reject each other. I'm saying love is the better way. Now, I'm going to wrap up with the ultimate point that I made in writing this book in the first place, which was, I think Marcus Ford, John Shelby Spong, John Dominic Crossan, Karen Armstrong have done an excellent job of demythologizing the Christian story and the New Testament. Karen Armstrong has also done a great job in dealing with both Islam and Judaism, the overall history of God. What they've not done is talk about what the implications of these things are. Once you let go of a moral code that is predicated on either a promise of reward or a threat of punishment, what is left to you? Do you turn like Nietzsche to the Übermensch and think that simply by scratching my own itches, by becoming a self-actualized individual, that I have achieved the greatest good? I had the director of our Mental Health Association in southern Missouri. I had written a grant request to do research on methamphetamine addiction, which is a real scourge in our part of the country, and I suspect it's a problem for you here as well. Agricultural areas where the ammonia from farming is available and some of the cold medicines, it's a terribly addictive issue. But what he said to me in giving several $1,000s and several months to study methamphetamine addiction, he said, there's 3 so's I need for your final report to answer. I need to know what is so, I need to know so what, and I need to know so. That is, give me the facts. Do the research to give me the facts. What is so? But you also have to be able to tell me, so what? Why should it matter? Why should governments be concerned? Why should school systems be concerned? Why should the court system be concerned? But thirdly, if you don't tell me so, if you don't give us some marching orders, if you can't describe what we should do in response to it, then your research is meaningless. And I don't want to say that the work of the demythologizing theological scholars of the last generation was meaningless, but they've done a good job of taking old belief systems away from us, but they have left us in the presence of a vacuum, a moral vacuum, that requires a response. Elie Wiesel, one of the survivors of the Holocaust, who wrote The Night, many of you would have been required to read that at some point. When he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, he said, or Nobel Prize for writing, I think it was, in his Nobel acceptance speech, he said, you could sum up the ethics of the Old and New Testament in a single sentence. Thou shalt not stand idly by. That is, the Holocaust wouldn't have happened without the silent consent of most of the world. In the United States, when shiploads of Jews escaping Europe came to the shores of the United States, our Coast Guard turned them back and even followed those ships along the coast of Florida in case some Jew wanted to jump off and try to swim to shore. We did not want to get involved. What Wiesel is saying is that the most evil things that happen in the world happen because the majority of people are willing to stand idly by. I think that at the end, when we have pulled ourselves away from orthodoxy back into a religion of orthopraxy, the future of the church, if it's going to have any relevance at all, is because we're going to be engaged in the major issues of social justice and ethics that face us in the world. Global warming is real. It's not a conspiracy among 97% of scientists to trick us into believing that the earth itself is becoming less and less capable of sustaining human life. There are issues that persons of ethics need to be able to address. We have a school-to-prison system that's predicated on poverty in the United States that goes on almost invisibly in our country. We have more black men in prison in the United States right now than we ever had black African slaves in the United States. We are imprisoning the excess workforce in a decidedly racist way of making those decisions, almost without conversation within the larger population. I could go on and on about what the social justice issues are, but you can even think about, most of you are old enough to have been present for the build-up to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously very young, but there was very little critical thinking that was applied to decisions that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. This is the kind of thing that we've got to be able to address in the future. So, I'm saying orthodoxy hasn't helped us. The absence of orthopraxy is killing us. For the church to have a relevant existence in the future, we've got to begin to address those issues. I'll stop now and take any responses or questions that you have.
Yes. You mentioned about like right thought, right speech, right actions. Maybe like the definition, like what's right then? Like, you know, you're saying like what is that? What's the basis for defining what is right? Like, where are you getting what is right thought? Like, is it just what I believe personally? Not any different from what you believe. So
Right.
that's why I was
Right.
you could define that.
And that's a very relevant question, and it has to be debated. The problem with a priori and a posteriori knowledge is that if you can say, like right now in Indiana, your governor wants to be able to say that religious people have a right to refuse service to people whose personal lives offend their religion, because they have an a priori view that heterosexuality is God's plan and homosexuality is evil. So who's right and who's wrong when you ask that question? And for many, many generations, people have been able to answer that question with a very flat-footed quotations from Scripture to say, because we have this revealed truth, we're able to give you a definitive answer. And unfortunately, a lot of more progressive thinkers then want to try to parse the meanings of those words. Well, Paul didn't really mean that, or Leviticus didn't really mean that. Well, what if they did mean that? What if Jesus of Nazareth was the biggest homophobe that ever walked on the face of the earth? Does that mean we have to continue to be homophobic? We have to be willing to apply critical thinking, even if our revealed texts tell us otherwise. When the Quran makes distinct differences between men and women in matters of inheritance, that may have actually made a certain amount of cultural sense within the context in which the Quran was written. It's clearly unfair and unjust today. And modern Islam is going to have to be willing to question the Quran and say, we no longer have an a priori truth set that we can simply defer to. We're going to have to be willing to ask the big questions and answer them as honestly as possible. And sometimes the honest answer is going to be, I don't know. We've got to be willing to live with a certain amount of uncertainty. That's one of the decisions. When you leave traditional religion and go to progressive religion, you're making the conscious decision to give up false certainty in favor of honest uncertainty. And that's a difficult decision for a lot of people to make. But there's, we no longer have a sacred text that we can turn to and say, here's all the right answers. The answers are not in the back of the book anymore. We have to keep searching for those answers. And they won't always be the same from age to age.
Right. Would you say that it might, like, the reasoning behind it isn't necessarily truthful reasoning? Sometimes it might become a biased reasoning, or like what they think is right, what people, I mean, I don't know, it just doesn't seem too convincing as far as, like everyone in this whole room, I don't know if we'd all have the same right thoughts, right, same idea for that, all that.
The fact that everyone in this room will not reach an absolute consensus should not liberate you from any responsibility for seeking what it means to be a good person. That we are not all going to end up with the same conclusions at the same time. I mean, there's still people who listen to Fox News even after they've been told that it's 87% inaccurate. They're making a personal choice. I can't understand why they're making that choice. If you already know that it's inaccurate and you're going to choose to watch it, who would inject poison into their brain? But people do it every single day because somehow it feels good. I don't know. It's an addiction that literally turns anger into entertainment. But what we're trying to do in teaching philosophy is to teach critical thinking skills that says, regardless of what you might want to believe about angels and demons and heaven and hell, there's 12 particles of matter and 4 forces of nature, and that's the only thing that we can reasonably talk about. Other things might be true, but we can't reasonably talk about things that cannot be tested or repeated. So we have to keep coming back to what can be known and how do we analyze what we can know to make sense of it. And sometimes it does. I wonder sometimes if comedy isn't the best way to deal with some of the things that we really need to question but have difficulty questioning. I speak at religious conferences from time to time, not usually twice. They usually only invite me once. But like most churches still only have male leadership. So you ask yourself, how does male genitalia feature in the writing and delivery of a sermon? I've been delivering sermons for 36 years and have not used my junk a single time. So I'm thinking maybe that presumption is mistaken. But you know, it's the willingness to open a door and say, now, come on, really? You know, every Catholic church you've ever heard of has got a statue of Mary, but they wouldn't let her preach because she doesn't have a penis? Does that really make sense? So we have to be willing to question our a priori assumptions to be able to come up with new conclusions. I'm sorry if that offended anybody, but I'm leaving tomorrow so it doesn't have to matter, right? Anybody else? Are they shocked into silence, or are they just sleep? Yes, sir.
I'm curious why, what in your mind is the particular value of progressive religion, not as distinct from traditional religion, but as distinct from no religion at all?
Yeah. Well, because I think there's tremendous value to community. I spend every Thursday working with homeless people in Springfield, and a team of 6 of us cook a meal and feed about 100 people. And I think staying in touch with the poorest of the poor helps to keep my religious writing and thinking and speaking grounded in the most painful reality. But outside of community, it would be very difficult for me to engage in that sort of thing. When Hurricane Katrina hit the coast, we took teams of people to go down and cut trees off of houses and gut houses and get people back living in structures. But as a lone wolf who has good thoughts, says the right words, does the right things, I don't accomplish very much, and I don't get challenged. One of the things my editors wouldn't let me get all the way through to the final version of my book is, I believe that almost every human being on earth will be just as big of an asshole as the people around them will let them be. And by putting ourselves into family and into community, we get challenged about those things. If we say that we think that the good person is a person who lives a life of radical compassion, I believe that that is much more